The lake had been the main reason I bought this property. A stunning, peaceful view, a private dock, and the quiet sound of water lapping against the shore every morning. It was paradise. What I didn't expect was that my biggest problem wouldn't be nature, but the people who lived near it, specifically the homeowner association. I wasn't part of the HOA, and that was made clear in the purchase agreement. My land sat adjacent to their little suburban kingdom, but it was entirely private. However, the local HOA, led by a woman named Karen, yes, an actual Karen, didn't seem to care about legal boundaries. In their eyes, everything around the lake was community property, despite the very real fence, signs, and legal documents that said otherwise. At first, it was just a few neighbors walking along my dock, acting as if it was part of their neighborhood park. I politely told them it was private, and most of them were understanding. But Karen, she was different. The first time she saw me outside, she marched up to me like she was addressing an employee who had messed up their shift. "This dock is part of our community," she said, her arms crossed, sunglasses perched high on her nose. "You can't just block it off like this." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I can. This property isn't part of the HOA. I own this dock, and I'd prefer people respect that." She scoffed, looking me up and down like I had just told her I was the King of England. "We've always had access to this area. The previous owner didn't mind." "Well, I do," I said flatly. "And unless you can show me something in writing that says otherwise, I expect people to respect my property." She huffed, but didn't push further that day. I should have known it wouldn't end there. Within a week, I started noticing small acts of defiance. My private property signs were being knocked over. The little gate I had set up at the start of the dock had mysteriously gone missing. On more than one occasion, I caught kids fishing from my dock, and when I told them to leave, their parents, standing nearby, acted like I was the bad guy. Karen, of course, was behind it all. She had convinced a group of HOA members that my dock was essential to the community and that I was selfishly hoarding access. Word spread fast, and suddenly I had multiple people ignoring my requests to stay off my property. I had no choice. I installed a full fence around the dock entrance and put up reinforced no trespassing signs. The next day, Karen showed up with 2 other HOA board members, fuming. "This is unacceptable," she snapped, pointing at the fence. "You can't just cut off access to the lake like this." I folded my arms. "I can, actually. This is my land." "You're going to regret this," she seethed. "I'm calling the police." I laughed. "Go ahead." And she did. Right in front of me, she dialed 911 and claimed I was illegally blocking a public access point. It took about 15 minutes for the police to arrive. Karen was already in full drama mode, telling the officer that I was ruining the community's lake experience and that I had no right to fence off public property. The officer, to his credit, listened patiently. Then he turned to me. "Sir, do you have proof that this is private land?" I smiled and handed him a folder of documents. Property deeds, land surveys, and even a letter from the county zoning office confirming that my land and my dock were private property, not part of the HOA. The officer nodded and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, this land is not HOA property. This fence is completely legal." Karen's face turned red. "That can't be right. We've always used this dock." "That may be," the officer said, "but this gentleman owns it now, and he has the right to restrict access." She spluttered, grasping at straws. But he's being unreasonable. We should have access to the lake." The officer gave her a level look. "That's not how property ownership works." Karen's face contorted with frustration. "So you're just going to let him get away with this?" "Yes," the officer said, "because he's not doing anything wrong." She stormed off, muttering something about legal battles and community rights. The officer gave me a sympathetic nod before leaving. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but I had a feeling Karen wasn't done. And I was right, because the next thing she did was escalate things in a way that would blow up in her face spectacularly. It started small. Karen, unwilling to accept defeat, sent out a neighborhood-wide email accusing me of destroying the community spirit and acting against the best interests of the HOA. I wasn't even part of the HOA, but that didn't stop her from painting me as a villain. The next day, I noticed trash mysteriously appearing near my fence. A broken lawn chair, empty beer cans, even a deflated pool float. It was obvious someone was trying to make my property look like a dump. I cleaned it up, but the next day more appeared. This was no coincidence. I installed security cameras. Within 48 hours, I caught Karen and 2 other HOA board members standing near my fence, deliberately tossing garbage over. I confronted them the next morning. "Karen, do you have any idea how embarrassing it must be to get caught on camera littering?" She scoffed, arms crossed. "We're just concerned about how your fence is affecting property values. Maybe if you weren't so hostile, people wouldn't feel the need to express their frustrations." "By throwing garbage?" I shook my head. "You do realize this is harassment, right? And I have footage that proves it." She didn't answer and walked away with the other 2, heads held high like they were the ones being wronged. The passive aggressiveness was escalating into outright aggression. The next escalation came a few days later. HOA members started congregating near the dock standing just beyond my fence, complaining loudly about how I had robbed them of their peaceful retreat. Karen was leading the charge, telling them that she had consulted a lawyer and that there were ways to challenge my ownership rights. It was all nonsense. My deed was airtight. But the fact that she was openly trying to instigate a legal battle told me she wasn't going to stop. She wanted me gone, or at the very least, to bow to her whims. One evening, I came home to find a group of kids climbing over my fence. Their parents, sitting nearby, pretended not to notice. "Hey," I called out, "get down from there. This is private property." One of the dads, a smug-looking guy in golf attire, waved a dismissive hand. "Relax, man. They're just kids. You don't own the lake." "No," I said, "but I do own this dock and this fence. Keep your kids off my property." Karen, of course, took this as an opportunity. "See," she said loudly, "this is exactly the kind of attitude that's ruining the neighborhood." As if enforcing property laws made me the bad guy. I called the police again. This time, I made sure to have my camera rolling when the officer arrived. I explained the situation, showed the footage of kids climbing my fence, and provided the previous police report where Karen had already been warned. The officer sighed. "Sir, you have every right to keep people off your land. Ma'am, if this continues, there will be legal consequences." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is ridiculous. He's being hostile. We're just trying to enjoy the lake." The officer shook his head. "You can enjoy the lake from the HOA's side. Stay off his property. This is your final warning." Karen left in a huff, but the harassment continued. The next morning, I found my fence spray-painted with the words, "Lake Hog." The cameras hadn't caught the culprit, but I had my suspicions. I sent the footage of Karen's previous antics to my lawyer. He wasted no time filing a cease and desist letter, warning the HOA that any further harassment would result in a lawsuit. I also went one step further and reported the vandalism to the police, escalating the issue beyond just a simple neighborly dispute. If they wanted to play games, I was ready. The letter must have rattled them because Karen disappeared for a few days. I thought, maybe, just maybe, they'd finally realized I wasn't backing down. But then she returned, and this time she had a plan that was so desperate, so absurd, I almost admired the effort. Not only did she start gathering more support from the HOA members, but she also began a petition to reclaim community access to the dock. Flyers started appearing around the neighborhood, painting me as a greedy outsider who had stolen a beloved part of the lake. She went door to door, spreading lies about how I had cut off an entire community from enjoying their natural resources. I heard from a few decent neighbors who warned me about her latest smear campaign, but others seemed to eat up her words like gospel. Some even began spreading rumors that I wasn't legally allowed to build a fence, that my ownership documents were fraudulent, and that soon the county would force me to remove my barriers. None of it was true, of course, but I could feel the tension in the air. The more she talked, the more people sided with her, and I knew the next stunt wouldn't be just talk. It didn't take long before Karen escalated things to a whole new level. After the failed legal threats and smear campaign, she must have realized that turning public opinion against me wasn't enough. She needed a way to force me into compliance. That's when I noticed a series of uninvited visitors inspecting my fence and dock. Strangers with clipboards, taking notes, snapping photos, pretending they were conducting official business. When I asked one of them what they were doing, a middle-aged man with an overconfident smirk responded, "We're assessing whether your structure complies with county regulations." I didn't need to ask who sent them. I called the county office myself, and sure enough, there was no open investigation into my property. Karen had arranged for some of her HOA cronies to pose as officials, hoping I'd be scared into removing my fence voluntarily. I made sure to take photos of these inspectors and sent them to my lawyer. He advised me to file a formal complaint for harassment. I followed his advice, but that only seemed to provoke Karen further. The following week, more strangers appeared, this time carrying measuring tape and walking right up to my dock. When I confronted them, they claimed to be concerned homeowners, checking for environmental hazards. It was laughable. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were actively building a false case to justify their harassment. One afternoon, I came home to find that my fence gate had been physically ripped off its hinges. The lock was cut clean through, and deep tire tracks ran through my property, leading down to the dock. Someone had driven a vehicle right onto my land. Furious, I checked my security footage, and there she was, Karen herself, accompanied by 2 HOA members, smugly dismantling my gate and cheering as a small golf cart rolled down toward the dock. I couldn't believe the sheer audacity of it. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I took screenshots of the footage, backing up every second of the video on multiple devices. There was no way she was getting away with this. I wasted no time calling the police. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was vandalism and trespassing. When the officers arrived, I handed them the footage. One of them let out a low whistle. "That's bold," he muttered, shaking his head. She didn't even try to be subtle. The lead officer assured me that they'd handle it and left to have a chat with Karen. I wish I could have been there to see her reaction when they confronted her with the evidence. Later that evening, I received an unexpected visit from Karen herself. She was fuming, her face red, her usual self-righteous attitude cranked up to 11. "You didn't have to call the cops on me," she spat, arms flailing. "We were just enforcing community standards." I laughed at the absurdity of her statement. "Community standards? You destroyed my property, Karen. You're lucky I'm not pressing full charges." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt cross her face. "We just wanted access to the lake. This isn't fair." I shook my head. "The law is fair, and I suggest you stay off my property from now on." The next morning, I woke up to a lawsuit. Karen and the HOA were officially suing me, claiming my fence obstructed community access to a shared natural resource. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. My lawyer, after going through the documents, was unimpressed. They have no case. The land deed is clear, but they're banking on making your life miserable with court fees and delays. I had no choice but to fight back. While we prepared for court, Karen's antics continued. Flyers started appearing around town accusing me of ruining the neighborhood. Someone even started a petition to restore lake access, as if I had stolen the entire body of water instead of simply protecting my own land. The smear campaign was in full force, but I wasn't backing down. What Karen didn't realize was that her arrogance had finally crossed the wrong person. One evening, I was walking down the street when a neighbor pulled me aside. "You should know," he said hesitantly. "Karen's been telling people you bribed the county to let you build that fence. She's saying the lawsuit is just a cover for a bigger case." I laughed out loud at how absurd that was. But it made me realize something. Karen wasn't just throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. She was actively trying to create a legal mess so overwhelming that I'd cave and surrender the dock access. To make matters worse, Karen doubled down. She went on social media, posting long, self-righteous rants about how one selfish homeowner was holding an entire community hostage. People who had never even spoken to me were suddenly commenting on my posts, calling me greedy and entitled. Some even suggested I should be removed from the neighborhood. It was beyond ridiculous. Karen had turned this into a full-scale war, and she was making it personal. At that point, I knew there was no reasoning with her. She wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted to win. But what she failed to consider was that I was prepared to take this battle further than she ever imagined, and this time, she had nowhere left to hide. The lawsuit was nothing but a tool for Karen to waste my time, but I wasn't about to roll over. My lawyer filed a countersuit for harassment, trespassing, and property damage, using the footage I had collected as evidence. The moment Karen received the legal notice, she went into full meltdown mode. The very next morning, I found her pacing outside my fence talking to a group of HOA members, waving documents in the air as if she were leading some kind of rebellion. As soon as she saw me, she pointed her perfectly manicured finger and shouted, "This man is trying to destroy our community. He is stealing from us." I sighed, pulled out my phone, and started recording. "Still trespassing, Karen? You know this is just more evidence against you, right?" She scoffed and turned to her audience. "He can record all he wants. The fact remains that this fence is illegal. We have the right to access the lake, and we are going to take this all the way to the county court." One of the HOA members, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "Karen, are you sure about this? I read the lawsuit documents. His land deed is solid." Karen shot him a glare so sharp I thought the poor man might spontaneously combust. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop us? This is about principle." I shook my head and turned to go back inside. That's when I heard the sound of something snapping. I spun around just in time to see Karen's teenage son and another kid kicking at my fence post. "Hey, get off my property," I shouted, marching toward them. The kids ran, but not before one of them landed a final destructive kick, sending a section of my fence toppling forward. Karen didn't even look remotely apologetic. "Well, maybe if you hadn't built such an eyesore, this wouldn't have happened." My jaw tightened. "You realize you just added vandalism to your list of legal troubles, right?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. No judge is going to care about a fence post." The police, however, did care. I called them immediately, showed them the footage, and within the hour, Karen was being handed another citation. This time, the officer was far less patient with her. "Ma'am, you're already under investigation for trespassing and harassment. Now you're allowing minors to commit vandalism on private property? I strongly advise you to step away from this matter before it escalates further." Karen, for once, had no snappy retort. She just stood there, arms crossed, her lips pursed so tightly they practically disappeared. Her silence didn't last long. 2 days later, I received a notice from her lawyer claiming that my fence was in violation of some obscure community easement law. My lawyer took one look at the claim and laughed. "This isn't even valid. They're grasping at straws. Let's move to expedite your countersuit." That same afternoon, the first court date was set. The moment I walked into the courthouse, I could feel the tension radiating from Karen. She was seated at the plaintiff's table, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. I could tell from the way she fidgeted that she hadn't expected me to fight back this hard. When the judge entered and the case began, Karen's lawyer launched into a passionate speech about preserving the integrity of the community. He painted me as an aggressive outsider, someone who had disrupted the peace by refusing to comply with the will of the neighborhood. Then it was my turn. My lawyer calmly presented the property deed, the recorded footage of Karen's trespassing, the evidence of the vandalism, and the documentation of the harassment I had endured. The judge barely had to deliberate. He ruled that my fence was completely legal, that Karen and the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, and that their repeated harassment was grounds for punitive damages. When the gavel struck, signaling the decision, Karen's face drained of all color. I walked out of the courthouse victorious, but I knew Karen wasn't done yet. She had lost legally, but I could tell she was already scheming her next move, and, as I would soon find out, she was willing to go even further than before. The court decision should have been the end of it. Karen had lost. The judge had made it crystal clear that my fence was legal, that my property rights were not up for debate, and that the HOA had overstepped their boundaries in ways that could have serious consequences. But Karen was not the type to accept defeat. If she couldn't win in court, she was going to find another way to make my life miserable. The harassment didn't stop. It changed. Instead of direct confrontations, I started noticing odd things happening around my property. My mail started going missing. Packages I had been expecting simply never arrived, despite tracking information saying they had been delivered. The trash collectors suddenly stopped picking up my bins, though every other house on the street had their garbage removed on schedule. When I called the waste management company, they claimed someone from the HOA had reported my address as vacant. Then came the calls. Late at night, always from blocked numbers. Silence on the other end, followed by a faint mocking laugh before the line went dead. It was classic intimidation tactics, the kind meant to wear someone down little by little until they cracked. But I wasn't going to crack. I started documenting everything, keeping logs, recording calls, and installing even more security cameras around my property. One night, the cameras caught something I never expected. Karen herself, sneaking around near my fence with a can of spray paint in her hand. By morning, the words, "Lake Thief," were scrawled across my property gate in bright red letters. I had her dead to rights. The footage was as clear as day, showing her in the act. I wasted no time in filing a police report. This time, there was no fine, no warning. Karen was arrested for vandalism. I wish I could say that was the end of it. It wasn't. While Karen was dealing with her legal troubles, the HOA had a meltdown. With their leader under fire, they scrambled to regain control, doubling down on their attempts to push me out. They sent out a community-wide letter warning that selfish property owners were ruining neighborhood cohesion. They called an emergency HOA meeting, one I wasn't invited to, where they voted on new community standards that would impose even stricter rules on every homeowner. What they didn't realize was that by doing this, they weren't just targeting me. They were angering a lot of other residents who were tired of their nonsense. A few of my neighbors, ones who had been quietly supportive but hesitant to get involved, finally snapped. They started speaking up, exposing shady HOA practices that had been happening for years. One resident came forward with evidence that HOA funds had been misused, including paying for Karen's personal legal fees. Another revealed that the HOA had been selectively enforcing rules, fining some residents for minor infractions while ignoring blatant violations by others. The fallout was brutal. Residents demanded a full financial audit of the HOA. Karen, still dealing with her own legal problems, was forced to step down as president. The board members who had been enabling her either resigned or were voted out. The HOA was effectively dismantled from within. As for Karen herself, she eventually moved out of the neighborhood. I heard she had to sell her house to cover legal costs. The last I saw of her, she was loading boxes into a moving truck, her expression dark and unreadable. She didn't even look my way. With her gone and the HOA's grip broken, life finally returned to normal. My fence remained standing. My dock remained private. And for the first time in a long while, I could walk outside without feeling like I was under siege. But the most satisfying part, the very people who had once sided with Karen, who had signed petitions against me and whispered behind my back, began to apologize. They admitted they had been manipulated, that they had believed Karen's lies until they saw the truth for themselves. One by one, they came to my door, some with words of regret, others with small gestures of goodwill. It didn't change the past, but it proved one thing. Standing my ground had been worth it. Karen had tried everything to take me down. In the end, all she had done was destroy herself. And I had won, not just the battle, but my peace.